It was a morning like any other. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the room. The sound of my pool filter gently humming in the background had always been a source of comfort. The soft ripple of the water and the occasional splash were as much a part of my morning routine as the cup of coffee I hadn't yet had. I stretched lazily, turning over in bed, ready to face another day. But then, it hit me. A sudden, deafening silence. No splashing. No gurgle of the filter. No soft shimmer of water reflecting on my ceiling. I lay there for a moment, disoriented, unsure if I had just woken up or if something was wrong. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, hoping the noise would return, but it didn't. I threw on some slippers and rushed to the window, looking out into the backyard, expecting to see the usual tranquil scene. Instead, my heart sank. My massive, meticulously maintained pool was empty. Not a single drop of water. It looked like a desolate, barren crater in the middle of my yard. What had once been a shimmering oasis, a place I spent hours enjoying with family and friends, was now a dry, cracked pit. I stood there for a moment, completely bewildered, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could this happen? Who would do this? And then I saw them. A group of HOA members stood at the edge of my property, arms folded, watching me like they were waiting for a reaction. Karen McIntyre, the president of our homeowners association and the neighborhood's self-appointed queen of petty rules, stood at the front. She had a clipboard in one hand, her expression a mixture of smug satisfaction and self-righteousness. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought she was going to say something that would make sense of this madness. "Good morning, Ethan," Karen called out, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I see you've noticed our little adjustment." I stood there, frozen, still processing the sight before me. My brain wasn't working fast enough to catch up with my anger. I stepped out of the house, my slippers barely making a sound on the grass, and approached her. "What adjustment?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen let out a deep, almost theatrical sigh, as if I were the unreasonable one here. "The HOA board voted to drain your pool," she said with a casual shrug. "We sent you a notice 2 weeks ago." I looked around, my eyes darting from her to the pool and then back to the group of smug faces watching me. "What the hell happened to my pool, Karen?" I demanded, my voice rising in frustration. She smiled, no, smirked. "It was an environmental decision. You're wasting water, Ethan. We're in a drought." I blinked in disbelief. "A drought? The city hasn't declared one. You can't just..." Karen raised her hand, cutting me off. "Oh, Ethan, the HOA has declared a drought. It's our responsibility to ensure the neighborhood sets an example." I looked at her, incredulous. "You drained my pool because of some example you think we need to set? And you didn't even ask me for permission?" Karen sighed again, like she was explaining something to a child. "It's not about permission, Ethan. It's about doing what's right for the community. We must conserve water." I gestured toward the perfectly green, HOA-mandated golf course a few streets over. The sprinklers were running full blast, spraying water into the air as if it were a monsoon. "What about that?" I asked, my voice rising. "Or the fountain at the community center? Or the fact that I pay for my water? What about all of that?" Karen just chuckled, that condescending laugh that made my blood boil. "Homeowners don't always understand what's best for them," she said dismissively. "That's why the HOA exists, to make those decisions for you." I clenched my fists, feeling my anger rise. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. This was a power grab, complete overreach. "You drained my pool," I repeated, trying to keep my voice under control. "You fined me for wasting water that I paid for, while the neighborhood uses more water on decorative plants than a city block." Her smile widened. "It's not about your money, Ethan. It's about doing what's best for the neighborhood. If you refuse to pay the fine, we'll put a lien on your house." I stood there, grinding my teeth, as the full weight of her words hit me. This wasn't just about a pool or a fine, it was about power, control, and making me bend to the HOA's will. And I wasn't going to let that happen. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in the rage that was bubbling up inside me. There was something Karen didn't know. Something that would turn this situation around. Something that would make her regret underestimating me. "Karen?" I said slowly, my voice now calm and controlled. "You don't understand who you're messing with." Karen rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Don't be dramatic, Ethan. Rules are rules." I smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that comes from knowing something no one else does. The kind of smile that warns the other person that they've just made a huge mistake. "You see, Karen," I said, my voice low but firm, "where do you think the water in this neighborhood comes from?" Karen's smirk faltered slightly. "The city," she replied, confident in her answer. I shook my head. "Wrong." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" I leaned forward slightly. 20 years ago, when this neighborhood was being developed, the original owners didn't sell the water rights to the city. They sold them to a private investor. Karen blinked, clearly confused. "And what does that have to do with anything?" I gave her a slow, satisfied smile. "That investor was me." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The sound of birds chirping in the distance. The faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. And then Karen blinked. Twice. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and confusion. "You're lying," she said. But there was a tremor in her voice now. I shrugged casually. "Am I?" She gaped at me, her confidence cracking for the first time. "You own the water rights?" I nodded. "Every drop of water that comes into this neighborhood? I control it. Not the city. Not the HOA. Me." The next morning, I sat on my porch, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. The peace was almost surreal. The birds were chirping, joggers were making their morning rounds, and the sprinklers on the HOA-mandated golf course were running as usual. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone, making a simple call. Less than 5 minutes later, chaos began. At first, it was subtle. The sprinklers began sputtering, spraying less water than usual. Some homeowners thought it was just a minor plumbing issue, but it got worse. Hoses that had been left running slowed to a trickle. Faucets inside houses started to sputter, and then nothing. By the time the first person realized there was a problem, the entire neighborhood was experiencing the same issue. People rushed to their backyards, trying to figure out what was going on. Then came the yelling. Karen, completely unaware of what was happening, stormed out of her house, phone in hand, and headed straight for the HOA office. She was met by a growing crowd of confused, frustrated homeowners. People knocked on doors, asking if others were having the same problem. The sprinklers on the golf course stopped mid-cycle, leaving the lush grass under the scorching sun, dry and vulnerable. The decorative fountain in front of the community center sputtered and collapsed into silence. Karen, frantic, barked orders at her fellow board members, but they were as clueless as she was. She called the city, hoping for help, but when the news came back, her face went pale. "They say they don't control our water," one of the board members said, his voice barely audible. Karen's jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous," she said, trying to hold on to her diminishing authority. "Of course they do." I stepped out of my house and strolled down the street toward the HOA office, acting as if I were just another homeowner trying to figure out what was going on. As I walked, I could hear the crowd whispering. The realization was sinking in. They were all connected now. Karen's so-called drought restrictions were no longer a power play. I reached the office and joined the crowd just as Karen saw me. Her eyes narrowed, and her face turned red. "Ethan," she snapped, "do you know anything about this?" I smiled and gave a casual shrug. "I thought the HOA was supposed to handle the water? Isn't that why you drained my pool?" The crowd murmured in agreement. People were starting to see Karen's hypocrisy for what it really was. She glared at me, her patience wearing thin. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she spat. I tilted my head, unfazed. "I'm not enjoying it, but it's fascinating to see how quickly the HOA is panicking now that they don't control everything."